Everyone, it's an absolute pleasure to be here, and like Stephanie, I'm very sad we're not in City Hall, but I'm delighted that so many people could be here this morning. I'm really delighted to open today's events, and thank you, Morven, for preparing me. I'm not sure I've actually managed to read everything, so I'm just going to see how I get on this morning. But what I wanted to say before my opening remarks is to say well done to Morven and Sustain for gathering the information for this report this year, when it's been so unique, such a unique year, such a challenging year, and we've been so incredibly busy. So to carry on trying to do some business as normal, or some level of business or reporting as normal, has been really incredibly valuable. And this report will be incredibly valuable as a resource, and just as a reminder of what we've all been doing this year, even if we need a reminder. The other thing I think we should say is well done and thank you to the boroughs for being able to submit the responses to this report. I know from first-hand experience in my work in my role at GCDA just how incredibly busy those people have been in those boroughs. And you know, my first meeting was at 7:30 this morning with someone in a borough. It went to 8, then there was one at 9, and that's how it's been since the middle of March, and it's still continuing. And now with the new winter payments, those people that had to start working 7 days a week in March are still working 7 days a week. So I'm very grateful and appreciate the response that the boroughs have given to this report, separate to the work they've been doing. So as Stephanie says, it's quite a unique report this year, recognising the unique circumstances. These reports have been around since 2011, and they were very much developed actually because prior to that, they'd not so much locally, not so much in Sustain, but maybe regionally and nationally, a real lack of appreciation of the core role boroughs play in our food system. And this summer, if we didn't know it before, has really demonstrated how essential the nature of our boroughs are in terms of supporting a sustainable food system. And those reports that have been around since 2011 have progressed and tracked improvements and improvements in responses, increases in delivery against a backdrop of increasing cuts to central funding to local authorities. So on the backdrop of years of cuts and then a pandemic, we had this exceptional response of boroughs this summer. And I know there are a few things that will be highlighted in the report, but at the beginning of this, I remember being in the boroughs subgroup, which my colleague Helen Crawley chairs, and Liam supports, and I know that Liam's on the call. And those first meetings were attended by 160, 200 people, up to 400 members across boroughs, working collaboratively, sharing best practice, rapidly sharing best practice to do everything they could in their power to support their communities. And then, and in addition, I chair the food aid subgroup of the London Food Board, which is also supported by boroughs. And the openness, the willingness, the commitment, the sharing of resources has been extraordinary. So I just want to say how grateful we are and how much we want to congratulate and show our appreciation of that extraordinary work. So I think the report really does that, and I think what's really brilliant about this report and the approach to the report is that highlighting how valuable it was to have some of those things in place already. So the relationships with the third sector partners, strong partnerships in place that really meant that some boroughs could really respond very quickly because they had so much of the foundation in place. The other thing that this report highlights, which is really important, is that cash first approach that we all really believe in. Food aid is an emergency response. We want money in people's houses, and this report really, really highlights that. I think the other thing that's really important in this report is how important it is that we have a diverse food system. So we don't want just supermarkets supplying our food. We want street markets, we want small businesses, we want our convenience stores. And this report really highlights how much boroughs did to ensure and support that diverse food system that is so essential for a sustainable, healthy food system for London. So that's really all I wanted to say, but yeah, congratulations to everyone for the report, for compiling the report, for bringing this event together. And thank you so much to everyone working so incredibly hard in those boroughs and continuing to. But I'm extremely proud to be the chair of the London Food Board at this time, and congratulations everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. That's a great introduction. And lots of hears in the chat for the hard work of Sustain. So I just wanted to pass that on too. One thing I should have said in my introduction, we are recording this session. So if for any reason you're in hiding, turn your cameras off. Otherwise, we'll assume that you're happy to be recorded so that we can share this session with others who haven't been able to join us this morning. So next up, we have two speakers from Sustain. I'm going to introduce you to Morven, who I'm sure lots of you have spoken to over the last couple of weeks. Morven is Sustain's London Food Poverty Campaign Coordinator and has overseen the development of this new style report, COVID style report. And she's focused on its particular food poverty focus. So that's Morven. I'm then going to hand over to Amy. Amy Lucky Sustain's Policy Research and Communications Officer, who has co-produced the report with Morven, with a particular focus on the sections in the report that relate to food economy, environment, and food growing. So let's start with you, Morven. Off you go.
Brilliant, thanks for that introduction. I'm just going to bring up some slides before I kick off. And always the joys of sorting your screen out on Zoom. That's always a fun way to start everything. But yes, brilliant. Thanks so much for the great introduction there, Stephanie, and for the overview of the report, Claire. I just want to echo everything that Claire said really around the incredible praise for everyone in boroughs who've been working so hard, and for people who were able to fill out the survey and share that vital information. There was really a depth of information in the survey, and it was so interesting to see all of the work that people have been doing. The case studies in the report are brilliant. Not all of the good work that we saw from that we were able to actually feature in the report. So some of those will be coming out in blogs that will follow up as well. So yes, as Stephanie said, I'm Morven, and Amy's going to be doing the second half of this presentation. We had a bit of an overview of what this report is, first of all, from Stephanie. As she said, it's, oh, 1 second, always the joys of slides. There we are. Yes, as she said, this combines and replaces two existing reports that Sustain has done for several years now. I'm sure that several of you will know about these existing reports and what they do. They catalogue the things that are done in London by London Borough Councils to secure a healthy and sustainable food future, which is the Good Food for London report, and the action that councils can take to address food poverty. In light of COVID-19 though, as I'm sure you all know, the pandemic threw up new challenges. It meant that boroughs had to do different work. It meant that some ongoing work had to be paused, and we wanted to bring some of the learning and the questions and the themes that we had in those reports forward, but do something that was appropriate to this context, because we knew loads of brilliant work was happening across the country and especially across London, and we wanted to capture and assess that and have that as a piece of learning going forward. So that's what we feel the report's been able to do. So just a little bit about how we did the report, first of all, before I dive into some of the specifics. We disseminated a survey to council officers who responded to questions on foundational works that predated COVID-19. So what was there before the crisis? The COVID-19 emergency response on food, which was quite gargantuan really, and any planned recovery work relating to food. In terms of the actual report that is just available to download on the website now, if anyone hasn't seen it yet, that it has several things pulled from the past two reports, but we omitted the usual league table that is usually right at the beginning of the report. We do assess councils on specific thematic areas, so who's kind of shown leadership on good food economy or on food access, but we omitted the league table of overall work just because we were aware of how much hard work was happening across London throughout the crisis really, and that different councils did well in different areas. So before I dive into some of the specifics of the report itself, just a little bit about the context. Even before COVID-19, as everyone I'm sure is all too aware, there was pre-existing pressure on public finances and services and a decade of welfare reform. So it's a difficult context that people were working in. It really is, and we do recognise that. And then against that backdrop, COVID-19 happened and kind of highlighted a lot of pre-existing issues that were already there, but also exacerbated a lot of the issues that were already there. So many thousands of Londoners lost income, food insecurity skyrocketed. Some of the statistics that we heard from the Independent Food Aid Network and from Trussell Trust around 600-700% increase in demand at specific individual food banks. You know, it was a very difficult context to be working in, and all of this meant that there was additional pressure on food systems, on food aid providers, and on local food economies to stay open and to make sure that people were able to access food. So just before I talk about the specific themes within the report itself, I'll just say a little bit about how we're presenting the data within each theme of the report itself. So in each section of the report, we have one map showcasing work done before COVID-19, so that's the foundational work that I was talking about, and one map showing how councils have built on or on these good foundations, or how they've undertaken new work that responded to the crisis. So those are the two maps and the outline work done across London. So this particular section, which we start the report with, is on partnerships and joint work, and it includes work done on food partnerships, food poverty alliances, food poverty action plans, as well as broader joint work with the voluntary and community sector. And I think, as both Stephanie and Claire touched on already, this is a really, really important part of what enabled and facilitated a good response. I think that was one of the kind of key lessons, that where there was infrastructure in place, this enabled things to happen really quickly and really efficiently. So the two maps together show that where there was quite good foundational work in place, there was a good response following that. Alongside this, though, we did see quite a lot of good new work happening. So the conditions of the crisis required that new joint work would actually happen. And one of the key lessons that we've seen from the data is how imperative it is for these new relationships to be fostered. So a little bit more about partnerships. So why was it that these kind of strong foundations enabled this good response? So for example, councils were able to utilise their ties and connections with the local voluntary and community sector to distribute food aid to those who needed it most really quickly. The VCS often has a good relationship with those who the council might not be able to reach for various different reasons, so that really helped. Also, where there were existing food poverty action plans, a lot of the planning from that was able to be used to create response or recovery plans. One key kind of caveat to all of that, though, is that it was really important. It might kind of sound obvious to say, but having a food poverty action plan in place is really good, but say where there is extra resource to implement the recommendations from that really made the key difference of having a council officer who was doing that, or having a multi-sector group who came together who was responsible for implementing that. So when the resource was already there before the crisis, that enabled a better response. So moving on to cash first approaches to tackling food poverty, this was another really key area for where we saw this connection between strong foundations and a good response after that. These measures being in place meant that the local population had a stronger safety net in times of crisis, so that meant more resilience in the local population themselves. So what we mean by cash first approach, this includes the council being a London living wage employer and promoting the living wage scheme throughout the borough, making sure that that's throughout the supply lines that they use as well, having more generous council tax reduction, and funding for local welfare assistance schemes, as well as wraparound services integrated within food aid or within people accessing other financial support. So it's things that get money into people's pockets directly, as Claire said at the beginning. So the reason that this foundation enabled a better response was predominantly to do with the council being able to slot in new or increased financial support so that that would reach people really quickly. And this also meant that there was a diversity of support to signpost to. If there's several different types of schemes where people can access support when they're in a time of crisis, that means that not everyone was going to being signposted to food banks, for example. I think that's the kind of more extreme end of the spectrum there. We saw that across the board, people were, councils were able to slot in this new support where that was, where they already had some kind of cash first approaches, just say by expanding the amount that people could access, or where people already had caseworkers saying that there's new support available, so the connections were there. But in a few rare cases, we also saw new schemes completely implemented, and I think which kind of was in response to how severe the crisis was. So that was quite interesting as well. Moving on then to food access, which covers physical access to good food, so whether people have healthy and affordable food retailers in their local area, as well as food for older people, in particular, Meals on Wheels. So we did see that there was a significant amount of good work on the first aspect of physical access to good food, which is mapping, so understanding the problem. Where are the areas of so-called food deserts or food swamps, and where are there areas that need new healthy food, affordable food retailers to be in place. There's a fair amount of good mapping going on, but I think the kind of next step of that is not quite so much in place. It is happening in some areas, but it's not always there yet, of kind of incentivizing healthy food retailers to set up, and also quite importantly to be able to continue in more economically deprived areas. In terms of Meals on Wheels, this was quite an interesting aspect of the crisis, that where these services did exist, they were able to play a really important role in responding to the crisis. So many were able to scale up quite drastically to meet new or increased need. Some of this was temporary need where people were shielding or self-isolating. And some councils actually used this explicitly as part of their strategy to keep hospital admissions down, because they knew that that enabled a particularly medically vulnerable demographic to stay in their own homes and not have to go out to the shops and all of that kind of thing. So it really played an important role in this time of crisis. Despite that, though, there are some Meals on Wheels services that are still closing, which is an area of concern. I think because there was such an impressive response from the voluntary and community sector, sometimes that meant that instead of existing Meals on Wheels services, these were signposted too. This can be a bit problematic, though, as I will go into shortly. Oh, apologies. So one of the final themes that I'm going to talk about today is just around children's access to food. This theme includes council support for free school meals, for breakfast clubs, for holiday provision with food, for breastfeeding in the borough, and for the Healthy Start scheme. So this is quite a broad theme. It covers a lot of areas. There is a lot of work that councils can do to support children's access to healthy food. So again, what we saw was where there was existing work to support this kind of thing, then councils were able to build on this quite effectively. So for example, in some councils, they have teams or particular officers who work on each of those areas that we've just talked about and that were included in this. So where there was existing teams that were in connection with schools and could support schools in this way, then those teams were able to kind of ramp up their work in response to the crisis. And there was just a really impressive initial response with the voucher scheme and a lot of support for schools that had to happen and that went on across the boroughs. So before we hear from Amy, who I'm going to hand over to in one moment, I'll just touch briefly on the emergency food response itself. For this, we didn't do scores and maps in the way that we did with the other themes throughout the report, just because there was such an impressive response from all the boroughs across London. Everyone basically showed good practice or leadership across the board. So as many of you will know, coordination hubs were set up really quickly in loads of boroughs. Many of these were linked in with the voluntary and community sector really quickly and efficiently to get referrals, food and other resources out to to people who needed them. Again, this was made more easy and made more effective where partnerships and alliances were already in place. And I won't go into the borough's food group meeting because we already heard about that, but that was a really important way for information to be shared across London. That the calls that I sat in on, some of them were really important for learning across boroughs and for understanding what was working in some boroughs, what difficulties people were facing, and just that kind of peer-to-peer support, sometimes with quite technical kind of practical stuff about sourcing food and that kind of thing, or refrigeration. So it was really tangible, specific way to help people out. Although there was a brilliant response, inevitably with something of this magnitude, there were some issues that did emerge. So in some cases there was a prevalence of unhealthy foods in food aid. This wasn't just with council provision, it's a problem that kind of predates the crisis, but we'd have kind of big brands donating not very healthy food, and that can mean that people who already really don't have very many choices and deserve to have more choices are limited into less healthy food. So that can be a bit of an issue. Saying that, there's some really great work in many boroughs to limit that and to make sure that there isn't too much of that kind of food in food aid. As I also touched on, some delivery of essential support, which was run by the voluntary and community sector, kind of over-reliance on that can be problematic. It's quite a nuanced issue because working with the voluntary and community sector is so key, but where essential services like Meals on Wheels, where safeguarding is really important, where food standards are really important, kind of pop-up responsive provision of that kind of service can be problematic and also quite difficult to sustain, because a lot of the volunteers were people who were on furlough. A lot of the sources of food that was surplus dried up quite quickly, so that can be quite it can fluctuate quite a lot and be difficult to sustain what is an essential service. Lastly as well, there was some issues that were just revealed by the crisis. I wouldn't say that this was an issue of the crisis itself, but existing barriers to food access that predated the crisis were revealed or exacerbated. So intersecting issues including ethnicity, income, and where people lived were doubled down upon by the crisis. So those who lacked access to green space or to fresh and affordable food found it even harder to access these things during the crisis. So in the report, we propose some actions that councils can take to address this that would lay good foundation for future crises and just be good in general work that councils could do. These include things like supporting Black-led voluntary and community sector groups locally, or ensuring planning policies ensure that everyone across the borough from different income backgrounds or different ethnicities are able to access growing spaces and green spaces. So that's me about finished with my sections, and that I didn't have time to go into the specific recommendations or any of the specifics, but that's all for many of the sections that I covered, but they're all within the report, and we'll also have some time to go into those in some of the breakout sessions. So that's me, and I will hand straight over to Amy.
Thanks, Morven. And yeah, if you don't mind clicking on my slides for me, I'll let you know when. So to carry on with the themes that we asked councils about on the next slide, the first theme that I'll talk about is food growing and production. So again, this follows the maps that Morven discussed with foundational work being in place before COVID, and then what responses councils put in place and had in place during the crisis. So with food growing and production, we looked at council activities around supporting food growing, And this included increasing access to land, supporting and protecting food growing and local planning, and also working in partnership with external organisations to initiate new food growing projects, but also support existing ones. So the next slide. We found that the majority of councils were already supporting growing initiatives, which is good. And this included things like school gardens, orchards, and tree planting schemes. And also, similarly to what Morgan's already said, we did see that councils who had foundations in place before lockdown, especially those who already had external partnerships in place to do with food growing, could take positive and quicker steps in their emergency response to supporting food growing. So while many food growing places were forced to close during the pandemic, around half the councils that responded to our survey, we saw that they were supporting community gardens to continue growing food. And some went beyond that as well to connect food growers to local food banks and local food providers. And we also saw a subset of councils who were mapping the land available for food growing in their borough, and also looking for ways and areas to increase local food production, and importantly as well, increase public access to that and availability of that land. And finally on this, some councils we saw had also managed to increase the amount of land available over the last year, which is impressive given the circumstances. So the next slide, please, Holman. So moving on to the next section that I'll be talking about is supporting a good food economy. And locally, we see the food economy consisting of a mixture of food businesses and enterprises, so many small and medium-sized enterprises like convenience stores, markets, caterers, box schemes, community shops. And in this case, we defined a good food economy as diverse, providing access to healthy and sustainable food, which represents local and cultural food choices and can adapt to change. So just to give a bit of context here. And so this section on food economy included plans and strategies that councils had in place to support local food enterprise. And this included things like good food retail plans and consideration of food business in climate action plans, for example, and public health plans. Also practical resources provided to food retailers and markets, especially in the case of increasing sales of healthy and sustainable food. And also a focus on developing a good food economy as part of recovery planning moving forward. So next slide, thanks. So we saw that most councils did already support their local food business and also responded to support the local food economy and retail during the crisis. And around half of the councils that answered our survey on this were engaging local retailers in emergency food provision for people in need. And many councils as well also work to support food enterprises and markets to stay open or to reopen after the first initial period of lockdown. And many councils made impressive responses here, supporting their local food economy, and be that retailers and markets selling fresh food. But a subset of councils sort of went beyond, as we saw it, and mentioned a plan going forward to provide healthy and sustainable food. Yeah, that's all I'll say for that slide. Thanks, Morgan. And then next, we looked into climate and nature emergency in food. And this section doesn't have a map because we asked more general questions here about climate, council's responses to the climate and nature emergency. So we asked questions around plans and strategies in place to do with climate and food. So 30% of greenhouse gas emissions come from the food system. So obviously fixing the food and farming system is one of the most important ways we can react to climate change, and is an urgent priority, as we all know, I'm sure. And we saw that an impressive 22 London councils had already declared a climate and nature emergency. And beyond this, 20 had released an action plan that included food in their declaration. Next slide, please. So we looked at food waste, procurement, land use and planning on how councils were reacting in this area. And we saw that food waste was the area that most London councils were taking action, So most councils offered a food waste collection service to household, some to schools, and less so to food businesses. And then looking at procurement and councils' powers as a licence grantor, we saw that only a few councils were currently using licensing and business rates to influence business behaviour, for example, like banning single-use plastics, which we saw at business events, for example, could have a big benefit. However, lots of councils were taking steps to serve more environmentally friendly food in their council catering. And we see one of the biggest climate and nature benefits coming from serving less but better meat, so this being really important. And then most councils had tree planting plans, but only some had, or mentioned at least, plans to include fruit and or nut trees. And finally on this, many councils did consider the climate and nature emergency in their in their emergency food response, which is very impressive again in this time. Next slide, please. So the final area that we asked councils questions on was around the healthier catering commitment. So as I'm sure you all know, or most of you know, this is the voluntary scheme promoted by local authorities to help caterers and food businesses make healthy improvements to their food. And this can be small changes such as offering smaller portions available, or changing drinks, for example, to lower sugar drinks, and also changing the cooking oil so it has less fat in it, for example. So on the next slide, according to the Mayor of London, 24 London boroughs have already adopted a healthier catering commitment. And in our survey, we saw that the remainder of boroughs who weren't participating mainly listed a lack of resources as the reason that many councils were planning on joining the scheme or trying to do something similar. And we saw councils had different focuses on, it was quite a broad range of answers. So some councils focused on businesses near school zones. Some councils had almost 100 businesses signed up to the healthier catering commitment. And also, in terms of benefits for business, councils were reporting that businesses had managed to save money because they weren't using as much sugar, for example. And then my final slide. So yes, finally, food recovery planning. So in response to the COVID crisis, we saw that councils in London used existing ties with the local voluntary and community sector, as Morven already mentioned. And some new partnerships were made and there was a lot of collaborative working. And fortunately, this new joined up way of working is in many cases now being formalised into new partnerships or alliances. And we see that support to many voluntary groups is being continued. And we saw that all councils had developed food transition plans for ongoing support during the transition from lockdown to recovery. But despite these positive steps, we see that more still needs to be done. As Morven mentioned as well, across the UK, unemployment has risen and it's predicted that London households will continue to lose income throughout 2021 and the next year. So we see that, yeah, charitable food banks that are established sort of a one-off emergency situations should not be institutionalised as a long-term solution to food poverty. So I thought that was an important point to reiterate and end on. And yeah, so that's it for the presentation. And just to remind you all that the report is now online in our publication section of our website, and we'll have a chance to discuss these themes further in the breakout sessions. So back to you, Stephanie. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy and Morven. That was really, really interesting. I wasn't actually answering emails. I was tweeting and posting on our website. So really, really interesting stuff. If you want to share the good news about this report or the fantastic developments in this report, there is a hashtag good food for all, and also hashtag London food response, so that we can get the word out there and get more people seeing what amazing responses the London boroughs have made. Now we are moving into the magic of Zoom. Are we ready? You need to hang on to your desks because you're going to be teleported into another space. The purpose of this is so that we can talk about some of the measures in detail. Each of the groups will have a chair from Sustain staff and an expert speaker. When you registered for this event, you would have chosen which breakout room you wanted to go to. So hopefully you'll end up in the right place. If for any reason you didn't choose a room or didn't register in time, just stay on while we will go off for a break and Simon will teleport you into the right place. We're now going to have a well-earned comfort break. It's going to be 10 minutes, and I would ask you to come back promptly at 10:55 so we can all get started. When you come back after stretching your legs, making a cup of tea, you will be in a different place. So on your screen, it should say join Zoom room, however it's described on the screen. I'm going to now leave this to the magic of the Zoom sphere, and hopefully we'll all end up in the same place and see you all in a breakout room soon.
Hi, Liam.
Hi, is that Monica? Hi, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Good.
How are you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks. Not too bad at all. It looks
Yeah.
like everyone, I can only see names, I can't see
Yeah.
so everyone else has hopefully got through the chasm, the Zoom chasm to join.
Yeah. Since we can see you, that's the important bit.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
I presume Morven is, I can see Morven is supposed to be on this. There we go. People are joining now.
Yeah.
There we go.
Hello all. We're just going to have a short break and before we start properly. So feel free to turn off your camera or anything like that. And just if we all join at 10:54, just before 10:55, and then we'll just kick off right on time on 10:55. But if anyone needs to go make a cup of tea or anything like that, please feel free to do so. And if you want to turn on your camera again when we're joined, that would be lovely. But it's also up to yourselves. So yes, I'll see you all in 10 minutes on the dot.
Simon, you've somehow managed to bring us all back.
You have Simon.
I might just give him a call.
Yeah, we need to go back to our breakout rooms. I've been waiting there.
Back, so this is also a good sign.
And this is the older people section, isn't it?
No,
I think there's 90 of us who've been brought back out of our breakout, so I suspect you need to just re-trigger the breakout.
Okay. For those of us with free bus passes, that's a statement.
Yeah.
Hello, Vida.
How are you?
I'm good, thank you.
Okay. It looks like pretty much everybody's come back, so it's
the joys of technology. I was
Yay. Hello.
Hey, is that Vida? We met the other day, didn't we?
Hello, I recognize your face.
How you doing?
Andy, she's aged. Don't talk to her.
Really? Well, Bill, as we've discussed, colleagues don't know you have anything to worry about there, do they? Yeah? You still...
For the older people section.
Vida, in Newham, we go with our showbiz age.
Yeah.
I know, it's just my absolute desperation to make sure I'm in the right place, because I thought I prepared for that one. I'd be in big trouble if I go somewhere else.
Oh, hiya. Can't believe how much he's grown, Andy, if you think about it at the start of the pandemic.
I know. He's had a great pandemic. He absolutely thinks this is the greatest thing. Out with you like every couple of weeks. Dad at home, mum at home.
Andy, did Wesley come in January or February, was it?
February the 8th. I went away and my last sort of chat with Jason was, how bad is this going to be? And when I got back, the conversation with Jason is, when do I need to go full time on this? And he said, look, I'll tell you when. I've been back about 5 days. And he just rang up and said, so when this is happening now? So that was sort of back end of February, wasn't it? And that's all we've done, isn't it? That's all we've done. Yeah.
I've just spoken to Simon. There's been a technical glitch on Zoom, which has basically cancelled all the breakout rooms temporarily. So he's doing his best to fix it. Bear with. We may end up having to slightly randomly reassign people to rooms, but we're going to try and get the right speakers into the right rooms one way or another. But it may be that we need to flex a little bit because it'll take time to get everybody reassigned. So just bear with for a few minutes, and Simon's doing his best to fix it.
Thank you. Hi, Claire.
Hi, Vida, how are you?
I'm well. How are you? Long time no see.
Yeah, long time. Surviving is the word to be used.
That is definitely it. Yes, yes.
I think this winter fund is a bit of a nightmare, to be honest.
Claire, I noticed you have a new surname. Yeah, you don't.
No, I don't have a new surname. I just use my maiden name at work.
Andy has a baby. Wow.
No, I've been married for years, but I don't use my married name at work. So. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Sophia.
Hi, Vida. Good to see you.
Likewise.
How are you, Sophia?
Yeah, always good to see so many familiar faces. Yeah, good. You're still in Merton.
Yeah.
Same. It's it's strange. We never meet.
Yeah, you fed up with the school meals yet?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you're more Rains Park, modern, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm not far from St. Heliers Hospital.
Ah, okay.
Hi all. We've had a small technical glitch. Thanks for bearing with us. You probably noticed, to be honest. But the breakout rooms have not done the magical thing that Stephanie was talking about. So we're not going to be able to put people into the rooms that they've chosen. I'm very, very sorry about that. We will be able to get speakers and chairs into the correct rooms. But please come with an open mind to discussing a new topic. They're all very interesting topics, and hearing about something you weren't necessarily expecting to hear about. And this is also a good time to plug that in the new year, we're also, because there's so much stuff and there's so much data and there's so much depth within the report, and even that we weren't able to fit into the report, in the new year, we're going to be doing one-off webinar series. We're not sure if it's going to be all of the themes in the report, but probably a bunch of the themes in the report anyway. So that will be a bit more of a deep dive. So you will have your chance to go into one of the themes that you really, really wanted to. You might end up in the breakout room that you chose, but you also might not. So I will let Simon start doing his thing and getting people. And we have
Simon saying,
yeah. Actually, people will have to pick a room. We'll sort it in 2 mins. So that's even better. You're going to be able to choose. You could even choose a different room to the one you chose in the first place. So things are changing quickly. Simon's going to sort that out in a second. For the speakers, please, and chairs, please do choose the room that you are supposed to be in. Anyone else, feel free to choose whatever room you want to based on the presentation. And yes, in terms of the webinars that we're going to be running, a lot of you obviously work in the areas that we've been discussing today. So if you're keen to get involved as a speaker or a presenter in any of those webinars, we'll be getting in touch with people anyway, but if there's anyone who wants to get in touch and wants to participate in those webinars actively, do get in touch with me directly. It would be great to hear from you. So I think we should be able to choose a breakout room shortly.
May I say 3 cheers for Morven, who has somehow managed to talk for 3 minutes to fill the gap. You need to have a job for BBC Politics outside number 10, I think, when we're waiting for Dominic Cummings to leave the building.
Start talking about the weather outside the building or something like that. Getting a lot of compliments for background screens as well. I think that would be the conversation. A lot of cat compliments and a lot of compliments for gardens in the background. I'm quite jealous of that, actually.
Sarah, is that not Sarah's real garden? Oh, I'm quite disappointed with that.
I'm not so successful. Yesterday I had to watch the squirrels eat, or the day before, eat all the bulbs that I'd planted. So no.
We'll be showing us the butler's pantry next.
Nice. This little guy's got to say goodbye. See you really later. Bye bye. Bye.
This is Keats Farm down in Welling, who grow to sell. So yeah, they're wildlife and nature friendly garden down there. So.
Hello everybody. Sorry about that, but you should now be able to pick the room that you wanted to be in.
How?
Has something popped up?
Not yet.
It should have popped up if you look at the bottom of your screen and it says breakout rooms. If you click on that.
Can't see anything.
Don't have a breakout room.
No.
Link.
Might it be where the 3 dots are more?
No, it's on the bar that goes across the bottom of the screen.
Across the bottom, yeah, where it says chat, share screen, record, and then breakout rooms.
Yeah, if you haven't touched it recently, it may just be black. There'll be nothing at all. But if you touch it, it will highlight the options.
There isn't that option on an iPad.
There
isn't anything here.
Yeah, no, I haven't seen anything.
If you take your I appreciate on an iPad there's not a cursor, but
well, maybe one group could wait in this and do it in this space.
If anyone's having issues, we'll see who's left at the end, and I can presumably assign you. Yeah, I can move people who's having trouble. So if everyone can go who can go, that would be great.
I'm having trouble.
Yeah. And Simon, I think I'm
maybe Macs don't have it.
No, I don't have it. And
That's okay. Okay. If everyone could just be quiet a moment, I'll just go through the list quickly then. So Adrian at Hackney, where would you like to go?
The children's one, please.
Thanks. Anya, is it?
Yes, thank you. The food strategy or food networking one, please. Great, thank you.
Alice Holden.
Can I go for children's, please?
Andy was partnerships. Yeah. Okay, this is okay. We'll get there. Charlotte Hall.
Food partnerships one, please.
Rebecca Lanning.
Yeah, partnerships as well.
Thanks. Effie was food
Yeah,
growing,
if I
think.
could do older adults.
Oh, sorry, older. Elliot Tarringay.
Sorry, I can't remember what it was called. I think it was food environment or something.
Yeah. Gillian.
Children's, please.
Thanks. Jabeen, you messaged me. Was it food deserts?
Yeah, food deserts, please.
Jamie Reed.
Food partnerships, please.
Thanks. Jonathan Pauling.
Yeah, cash first, please.
Katie Brown.
Partnerships, please.
Katie Barker.
Local economies, please.
Kimberly CPAG. I know. Sorry, you're. Yeah, got you. Latifa.
Room 4, please.
Laura Flanagan, I think it was. Children, I think, wasn't it? Liam Weeks.
Cash first, please, Simon.
Lisa Bennett.
Children, please.
Lisa Henry.
Older people, please.
Louise Titzer, if I've said that right.
Partnerships, please.
Marcus Robinson.
Children's, please.
Margaret.
McLennan?
Yes.
Yeah, food deserts, please.
Marlene.
Local economies, please.
Great. Mikhail.
Older adults, please.
Miranda Williams.
Older adults as well, please.
Monica.
Cash first, please.
Oh yes, of course.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for bearing with us. I really appreciate that. You know, it added a little bit of spice to the event, to the Zoom event. It's not quite what we were expecting. We were all smoothly in there, and then I think the timing just hadn't worked for some reason. So we would have only had 15 minutes in the original breakout rooms, which was wrong, and then it wiped all of the sorting that Simon had done ahead of time. So you never can tell with these things. Sometimes they just go a little bit wrong. Which does mean that we have a little bit less time. So I will crack on straight away, and I won't take up too much time because I've already spoken quite a bit. Then we may have other people joining us in a second if there's anyone else in the breakout room that Simon was still putting into this breakout room. But just in case anyone is wondering, this is the discussion group. We'll have just under half an hour altogether on cash first approaches and to tackling food poverty. So there's a whole section on this in the report, that's pages 14 and 15, and it covers a lot of the work that was in the Beyond the Food Bank reports previously on work that councils can do to support the London Living Wage, council tax reduction, local welfare assistance schemes, and other type of kind of support that can go directly to families, like discretionary housing schemes and those kind of things. As well as we included in this, it's I suppose it's not strictly speaking cash first, but it's so strongly linked. We think the kind of wraparound support services like debt advice, benefits advice, that kind of thing, that can help people with some of the some of what can be the underlying causes of poverty. Some of those are broader and more underlying than those kind of services can speak to, but they're quite important as well. So where those are slotted into food aid provision, or to other types of services that people would be accessing, so that they can access those at the point of getting direct services as well. So as I said in the overview, this was one of the key areas where we saw really strongly when there was a good foundational work before the crisis. This was able to really come into its own in terms of new work during the crisis, this and the partnerships model as well. It's true across the board, but it was strongest in these two themes. Because in a lot of cases where councils had support already in place, they were just able to expand the amounts that people were eligible for, loosen eligibility criteria, simplify application processes, or if there was caseworkers who were already working with people, then they were able to just signpost them to any new support that was out there. So it just made it really quick and easy for people to do any new work. So we have a bunch of recommendations in the report about things that we think councils should be doing. Most of them are quite kind of straightforward. I'll just run through them really quickly and post them in the chat as well. I think only we'll be able to see that, but I'm not actually 100% sure. So the first of those is to establish and fully fund a local welfare assistance scheme if there isn't one already, have a low council tax minimum payment, have a direct referral route from the local welfare assistance scheme into preventative support. So that's the wraparound services that I was just talking about. Have a discretionary housing payment scheme in place. So that's another type of support that people can have, and also acquire London Living Wage and Living Hours accreditation, and make sure that this is throughout the supply line and support and promote this throughout the borough. So those are the recommendations from the report. So before we get into the discussion, which this session is going to be, I'm just going to hand over to Lizzie Mahoney, who works at the GLA and was actually brilliant and helped us out when we were developing the questions for this for the survey for this report, and gave us some advice on the types of questions that we should be asking. So thanks very much for doing that, Lizzie. It was really, really helpful. So over to you.
Thanks, Morgan. Yeah, so my name's Lizzie and I work for the GLA, so the Greater London Authority, as part of our Equality and Fairness team. So what we do is focus on how the Mayor can use his powers to support Londoners on low incomes and tackle poverty. So saying that means I'm speaking from a regional government perspective rather than a local government perspective. And I know local government is so key to delivering in this area, so really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and perspectives and challenge on what I'm going to say. So to follow what Morven said, I suppose the key point to make is that food poverty is ultimately an issue of income, and it's caused by low pay, insufficient and insecure hours, inadequate levels of welfare and increasingly unemployment. And in the context of COVID-19, local authorities adopting cash-first approaches was about ensuring that if people aren't able to access food for economic reasons rather than physical reasons, that they're supported through local welfare assistance schemes, advice, and through income maximisation in the first instance, rather than being provided with a food parcel or being referred to a food bank. And more broadly, in the wider context and going forward, cash-first approaches are about ensuring people have enough money to be able to afford a healthy diet, as food banks aren't a sustainable solution to food insecurity. Though I realise I'm probably preaching to the converted here. And the reason people talk about the benefits of cash-first approaches is because they can play a crucial role in tackling the underlying causes of food poverty, as well as other manifestations of poverty like fuel poverty, because we know that too often people face a choice between heating their homes and feeding themselves or their household. I think it's really important, though, to recognise in this conversation that it's widely, if not universally, recognised that getting more money into people's pockets is a crucial way of tackling food poverty. But there are serious challenges, as you all know, for local authorities who've been affected by cuts, for example, to council tax support funding, and have to balance the drivers between, on the one hand, introducing a generous local welfare scheme with the drivers to ensure those schemes are sustainable and can continue to support residents in the long term, which is why a united voice calling for greater resourcing in this area from central government is also so important, because money for direct wraparound services, for advice, for job support and employability work is just as needed as money for direct food provision. And that disparity in funding scenarios that I described is one of the reasons why local authority schemes vary so much between council to council. The Sustain report, as Morven described, gives examples of some great things local authorities are doing against this really challenging backdrop. So, for example, being a London living wage employer and encouraging other employers and those in your supply chain and those you fund to pay the London living wage. Maximising council tax reductions, so having either no minimum payment threshold or a very low one wherever possible, and investing in wraparound services that help address the root causes of poverty. And as we probably all know, so over the first lockdown, some local authorities were able to boost welfare provision over the crisis or extend the eligibility using their allocation of the COVID-19 Hardship Fund. It would be really interesting to hear about your experiences of deciding how to use that, and any thoughts about how you might be allocating the winter support grants that councils are getting ready to spend in December, as well as whether you're able to start thinking about longer term strategies in this area. In terms of what the GLA is doing in this area, so we're currently in the early stages of planning the London Recovery Programme, which is the kind of flagship programme looking at London's recovery from COVID-19. And this programme takes a missions-based approach. So we have 8 areas where we want to make a really practical difference using the resources of the GLA, London councils, and other partners from anchor institutions in the city. One of these missions, which is the one that's relevant here, is about securing a robust safety net for Londoners. So the idea is that by 2025, no Londoner will be unable to access advice and information in order to prevent or alleviate financial hardship. So part of our thinking as part of that robust safety net mission is that we want to engage local authorities on local welfare assistance schemes, and work together to kind of coalesce around a number of asks of government or examples of best practice. But this will be done absolutely in partnership with councils and understanding, I suppose, of the challenges and barriers involved in this work. And it will build on previous work done by the partners. So, for example, there was a report last year by London councils which looked at welfare approaches adopted by local authorities in London, and the GLA ourselves, we've done a report on best practice in council tax debt collection schemes. As well as that, so that's the local welfare side, there's also another key part of the mission which is about supporting emergency food or emergency crisis support provision, including food aid, all the while acknowledging that that isn't a sustainable way of ending food poverty. So our work would focus on improving partnerships between food aid providers and the surrounding advice and guidance infrastructure in an area to provide really holistic wraparound support for people accessing food banks. For more information about any of those things that I just mentioned, I can definitely pop some links in the chat or answer any questions. But yeah, I look forward to having a discussion with you about the kind of barriers to adopting some of those approaches that we know we all think are the best thing. And yeah, I'll hand back over to Morven to chair the discussion. Thank you.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Lizzie. That's really informative and really useful. I think in terms of the discussion itself, as there's a smaller number of us, I think it's absolutely fine for people to kind of jump in. So the first question that I'm going to ask is around what happened during the crisis. So this is just an opportunity to kind of reflect on the things that we saw happening during the immediate weeks of first lockdown, or anything that's kind of changed as a result of COVID-19, and an invitation to reflect on what you think should be continued out of that, as well as what maybe should be stopped. So that I'll pop that in the chat as well, just to make sure it's clear, but it's just what happened during the immediate height of the crisis that should be continued. So any new kind of ways of working that you think should be continued. I'd also welcome broader reflections as well on anything that we've heard today, or any other broad reflections. We're going to move on in the second half of this discussion to what we think should happen next and what's kind of still missing from the pieces of the puzzle, so there'll be an opportunity to talk about that. But if anyone does want to jump in on that, feel free to jump in and to introduce yourself when you do that as well. Or if there's a few of us speaking, feel free to raise a hand and I can kind of come to you. So in terms of cash first approaches, any of the things that Lizzie was talking about now, was there anything that anyone wanted to share?
I can kick things off if that's okay, Morven.
Brilliant.
So I think I know everyone on the call, but I'm Liam. I work in the GLA food policy team alongside Lizzie in the equality fairness team. And I think in response to this first question, obviously one of the recommendations in the report is formalising or embedding food partnerships, whether they be food poverty alliances or local food partnerships, joining up to the Sustainable Food Places Network or the Food Power Network, which is really important. And I think to go beyond that, I think one of the things we saw very early on when we were working with community food hubs and local authorities was establishing single points of contact within borough leads and linking them with London Food Alliance leads in each local authority. And at the moment, it's something we're working on again because of the movement of people either being redeployed to other roles or going back to their existing role. And alongside that, the infrastructure that was set up, the community food hubs, being, returning to their original kind of use as well. And it's that movement, it's that transition that is sometimes one of the hardest things to deal with if you don't formalise partnerships and if you don't have that single point of contact throughout. I think that the one person or having one or two people that you can go and talk to in a local authority, or the VCS can go and talk to in a local authority, at times of crisis, but also in times of transition and recovery is really important. So we're doing some work at the moment. The food team are doing some work through the strategic coordination group to try and establish those points of contact, make them more prominent on local authority web pages, and ensure that people know who they can go to, no matter what kind of phase we're in. And I think that's quite closely linked to the partnerships, and forming partnerships would help facilitate that too.
Yeah, thanks, Liam. That's really useful to hear. Yeah, go ahead, Chris.
Sure. Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Chris. I work for Haringey Council. So kind of on the first question, I think, so as part of the food response, we opened 2 emergency food hubs, one at the Spurs Stadium and one at Alexandra Palace. And I think, so prior to kind of COVID, we were literally about to set up our kind of food kind of network in Haringey. So we actually had our first meeting kind of around kind of February time. Then it got kind of pushed back, but kind of in the aftermath of COVID, we have set up our food network now, which has been really good. And I think the main kind of takeaway that we've kind of taken from the immediate crisis is just kind of our kind of new connection we've got with our VCS sector, and how kind of those connections have kind of driven forward kind of this kind of combined working. And I think the kind of influence that they're kind of having on the council's kind of direction and kind of strategies. So for example, we're kind of working on a kind of resident resilience kind of piece at the moment, and kind of part of that we've also got, it's got like a food strand, it's got a kind of ethical debt strand, it's got a financial resilience strand. And I think we're kind of the VCS are far more involved in kind of the kind of strategic oversight of that than they would have been prior to COVID. So I think that's something that we've really kind of taken away. On the kind of cash first approaches side of it as well, I think so. Like at Haringey, we've got like a council tax reduction scheme. We're like a London living wage employer, etc., etc. And I think kind of the issue around it just does come down to finances essentially. So like Haringey, we've kind of got a £20 million kind of deficit at the moment that we've got to try to fit in. And so it's just kind of, as we kind of read through the report, there's so much good work that obviously we would really want to kind of implement, but it is just a case of we just can't do it at the current kind of budget situation that we've got. But I was just speaking to my colleague kind of earlier, and we were saying that it's kind of a case of us going through the report and seeing where we think we can have the best impact for kind of what resource that we have. And I think that's kind of what we're going to be kind of taking away from reading this report and hopefully implementing into that kind of resident resilience piece that I just talked about. So yeah, thanks.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thanks, Chris. It would be interesting to know from that process what specific councils do come away with in terms of thinking about this is what we can have the most impact with in terms of our money. We do recognise, obviously, that I don't think there's any councils that have all of the recommendations in place, and that's a really hard thing to do. Some do come close, and there's a lot of good work across a lot of boroughs, but yeah, from a council perspective, which of those are kind of most you get most for your money, I suppose, is a really interesting thing. So I'd love to hear more about that. And in terms of having the lead contacts and the lead that you were talking about, Liam, I'd be interested to know whether and to what degree those kind of have stayed in place. Like you said, in this transition phase, sometimes really good work and good foundations can dissipate. With all the best intentions of the world, it's really hard to hold on to new connections when structures do change. And I'd be interested to know, from your perspective, whether that has been the case, or in some cases that has been just too hard to keep together.
Yeah, no, I think it has dissipated, which is understandable, because we were, 2 months ago, I think there was very much a sense that things were returning to or moving into transition, and local authorities were stepping away slightly from the crisis emergency response mode, had strong links with VCS, and our sense was that actually that was the right action at the right time. And then we returned to a stage where there was new funding being announced by government. Local authorities have had to respond very quickly, still haven't got guidance for that funding, despite the fact they're going to receive it in December, and are very quickly trying to establish what they're going to do with it. So there's certainly something to be said for a consistency, I think, in funding and being reimbursed for the costs that were initially incurred, which I don't think happened from what we've heard either. And knowing when announcements are going to affect local authorities when it comes to cash first approaches, well in advance, so that they can plan accordingly for it. And that not just plan from a resource perspective, but plan from a people perspective as well, who's going to be working on it and who will be that lead point of contact. It works both ways, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. We do want more funding from central government in general, but a little bit more lead-in time would be incredibly useful. Katie, go ahead.
Hi, I'm Katie from the LGA. Liam, I was just wondering, the single point of contacts that you were getting together, is that solely related to food, or is that just for more general crisis support?
Yeah, it was just on food, actually. It was who in each council, when the 53 community food hubs were set up during the first lockdown, could be contacted by the London Food Alliance partners, and who was coordinating the local authorities, distribution of food aid. Obviously, it didn't always sit with the local authorities. Sometimes it was a VCS-led response. But yeah, they're the contacts we established early on, but just on food.
Can I say something? This is Monica from Waltham Forest.
Go ahead, yeah.
Yeah, I think the concern here is we're working more and more with food banks, and people are being referred to food banks as a first instance, as a intervention. How do we stop that? Because, for example, the council now is working with food banks in terms of supplying them with food to distribute.
It's tricky, I would say, and I'd invite others to jump in as well if they have thoughts on this. I mean, I think that there are a few things. obviously pending resource and what the council is able to do in terms of finances. But I think that having those cash first, having a diversity of things that can be signposted to, helps mitigate the institutionalization of food banks. So where people are able to, not always, we know that in some places the first port of call when someone was in crisis and couldn't afford food was to send them to food banks. And from our point of view, food banks should be a kind of one-off crisis response, and having a diversity of things that you can signpost people to, like emergency grants for people if they can't afford to buy food, rather than them being signposted to food, being signposted to money so they can afford the food is always preferable, I think. Obviously it is tricky to fund everything, but those kind of things, local welfare assistance schemes, other things that will get money into people's pockets quickly, can help mitigate that kind of institutionalization. It's a particularly difficult context at the moment, as everyone knows. And then I suppose also in terms of well, just the wraparound support, really, so that when people are going to food banks, that they're able to, you know, there might be someone with a table or a desk that you can go and get some advice about. So linking in people from one aspect of the VCS and another aspect of the VCS, and sort of putting them together in the same place in that way, and linking wraparound support with emergency food aid can help mean that people don't have to keep coming back again and again. I don't know if anyone else wanted to jump in on that as well. Maybe Lizzie. Yeah, it's tricky, I would say. Or Liam, if you had anything to add on that, those would be my main points.
I've spoken enough already. It was more of a question actually on that first, I suppose on one of the first recommendations, or the principle of integrating wraparound support with food aid organisations, and actually whether this is something we're considering at the moment, and it'd be interesting to hear other people's opinions, whether that is firstly the right thing to do, and secondly the most effective thing to do. Because we say, I don't know whether it contradicts the principle of embedding food aid, because if I understand, you know, you're trying to integrate wraparound support so that people aren't having to go to food aid operators, but then if we're integrating that wraparound support in those settings, then if we're also trying to get rid of food aid providers, then where does that support go? Is it better to focus on integrating it somewhere else? And if so, where are those? Like, for example, Alexandra Rose, Jonathan work a lot in children's centres. What other kind of places are people who are falling through the gaps in welfare support or need crisis support visiting, where there might be a more sustainable solution to this, to integrate wraparound support as opposed to food aid providers?
Because I suppose otherwise food banks become the community hub whereby people find connections to other services, whereas as you're describing, are there other places where people present which can serve that purpose?
And I think I really think it's a really interesting point that we're creating a bind.
Oh,
Jonathan's cut out.
We've lost you, Jonathan. Hopefully Jonathan will come back, but just to let you know, Jonathan,
I think he's back.
Am I back?
Go ahead.
Okay.
Yes, you are. Can hear you.
Yeah. I just think it was a bind before the crisis, and it's become even more of one now. And I think it's generally I look at it from a perspective of, you know, do we want to institutionalize food banks as the response to food poverty and low income? But you've made a really good point, which is many of them are sort of pivoting to become, you know, this more than just a food bank and producing these wraparound services, which on the face of it is a good thing. But actually, is it helping to strengthen the institutionalization of food banks as the default response to this problem, rather than embedding saying those services are crucial for reducing people falling into food poverty? Let's set them up and make sure they're well resourced and supported, rather than in the traditional way, rather than embedding them within food banks, and leave food banks to do what they do at the moment and try to find a way of putting them out of business in the long term. It's really an interesting find. And I think, you know, local authority, I mean, going to Monica's point, local authorities have to think carefully and creatively about how they don't become de facto supporters of this institutionalization. But it's really hard because you've got to support them because they're so desperately needed. So it's just this circular bind that we find ourselves in. But I do, you know, the reason I came to this breakout group is because I want everyone to encourage everyone to look at innovative responses to cash first, and a way that drives us away from that emergency food response, because I do think I'm just really worried that we're becoming just like the United States, where it's an accepted part of the substitute welfare system. And it shouldn't be. So, you know, we want to, you know, we've got a vested interest. We'd like to encourage local authorities to invest in voucher schemes, because that allows people to use their own discretionary cash spend to go and spend it on healthy food, fruit and veg at local markets, supports local food economies, it supports those local families, and at the same time, because it's embedded in children's centres, it naturally connects people into all of those other support and advice services. So, you know, we think it's a really sensible use of public money, but you don't get as much volume of food when you put it into fruit and veg vouchers as you would if you put it into establishing a food bank where the food supply chain is free, because it comes from the waste problem that our lovely supermarkets tend to have. And they find it really convenient that they can dump it somewhere and it makes them look good at the same time. Sorry, rant over. Just in time by the looks of things.
That was useful.
Yeah, really, really useful. I think we've got a minute, so just wrap up. I think we did more or less cover some of the things in the second question anyway, around what is needed next. I think, Jonathan, you put that really well around innovative approaches and thinking outside of the box, and not just going down the route of following the footsteps of the US in this regard. And I think, Liam, it's a really useful prompt that around how we kind of ensure that wraparound services are integrated into where people are without then institutionalizing food banks. And I think it's a nuanced question, and I think that for
just the mutual aid groups, you know, there are a lot of other people who want to do, you know, create the best for communities, and not just around food, but in sort of addressing sort of racial inequalities, language inequalities, and poverty generally. So, yeah. So people are really thinking and really meeting and coming together to change that. Yeah. And lots of good examples of that happening across the country as well. So, yeah, I think we just need to be open to trying different things.
Yeah. Thanks, Dee. Sorry to everyone else that's ended up hearing the end of our conversation. We all left our breakout group way too enthusiastically, and then it was just us, so we carried on. But hello all.
So thank you, everybody. We are doing very well with time. We're almost on schedule. So this is the bit where we all come back into the space together and share the contents of our breakout group. So to do this, we have Sarah Williams, who is going to chair this part, and everybody's going to have the opportunity to feedback. It says on my notes that this is going to be feedback via Mentimeter. I have no idea what that is. I'm quite excited. It's another experience. So Sarah, take it away. Am I going to be jettisoned somewhere? I'm not quite sure.
No, what you need to do is either get another window up on your screen, or you can use it on your phone if you want. So basically, yeah, we're going to use Mentimeter. If none of you have used it, it's a really good feedback platform. So what you need to do is put www.menti.com into your browser, and then the code is at the top of the screen, which is 9869899. Correct, isn't it, Morgan? And then first of all, I don't know how, if everyone knows their room numbers is the problem. So do you know, I've got rooms 2, 3 and 5, but I don't know what 2, 3 and 5 we're talking about.
So are the dignified access to food aid, older people and
children.
Yes. Children. Okay. So if you were in one of those groups that was just mentioned, so access to food, dignified response and children broadly, then what we want you to do is and this is everyone who was in the groups, not just the person facilitating. We want to know what were the key takeaways from your session. So if you could just start to type in, and this is where you will see my commentator skills, and I will start to feed that back, but obviously you'll be able to read. Oh, the screen's gone. I think Morven's going to share the screen again so we can all see what's going on. But basically, if you can all just start typing in some of your takeaways from that session, or just type in one takeaway from the session the discussions that you just had, that would be great. And as Morven. Can you share your screen again, Morven?
Yes, shall do. Just 1 second, sorry. And it's also everyone from physical access to good food. So food deserts and food swamps as well.
Food deserts, food swamps, okay. Ensuring dignified access. Okay, so there's some really sort of practical stuff here, switch from chilled to frozen food. Some big questions, is food a health or a social care issue? I would say probably both. People saying they've discovered some initiatives that we must hang on to. How we devolve power from councils to community groups. That's really interesting, is this balance between how we work in partnership with community groups without putting too much pressure on them. People have talked about how that came up in ours, I don't know if it's the same, but how convenience stores have great relationships with vulnerable families and how we can work more with them. Free school meals provision not enough. We need to work together with the VCS, so yeah, big voice there. Also the balance between NHS, public health and social care in ensuring older adults are getting the support they need. So I think that's really come out strongly as some of the people that may have slipped through the net before, and how we're seeing, you know, those VCS areas where they had a good provision, being able to step that up. Yeah, some more stuff around breakout children, level of activities to support food poverty and the need that is there too. So, you know, yeah, really addressing some of that need that's there. Or some of the climate stuff. So I think some people from other groups are starting to chip in, which is fine. Yeah, so people now talking about climate, there's some good value climate wins. That's a practical point here about having a platform to share knowledge and experience in response to dealing with common issues. So I think that's what we saw again with the borough's food group, was how important it was to have somewhere to share information. And again, that came up in our group with a lot of the retailers not knowing where they stood or what they should be doing, and the council not having those clear links with retailers at the start of the crisis. Again, some more stuff around cost of malnutrition in older people, and what that costs the NHS and how we should be preventing that happening. Okay, Maureen, do we want to move on to the next set of groups? So if you haven't already, then if you were in so we're doing the same groups, what needs to happen next? So tell us what you think needs to happen next if you were in those groups. I know some of you probably put some of that already in your comments.
Oh, it should come up automatically for you, I think, on your screen. So it might just take a few minutes for that to start coming through on our...
Great. So I give people a bit of time to reflect. What do you think needs? So people need cash solutions to be able to afford healthier food. Too much reliance on food aid. Yeah, here. So, you know, we know that food aid is the sticky plaster that unfortunately sometimes is needed, but that shouldn't necessarily be us over relying on food aid. And we also had an interesting question in our group about Brexit and the impact of Brexit and what that might do to things like food surplus. Campaigning to change free school meals eligibility rules. Sorry, need to put my teeth back in. And don't let under fives be left out of food aid solutions. Partnerships and networks which sprung up during the crisis need to be formalised moving forward. Yeah, we've seen some great new alliances and partnerships forming, and we're going to be working really hard. And if anyone needs any support on that, do get in touch with us at Sustainable Food Places. Addressing health inequalities, open discussion, inclusive plan with those most affected at the centre. So yeah, how do we put those with those lived experiences at the centre of planning what happens next? Developing strong foundations for holiday provision next year. That's really important. Invest in social enterprise development as a route to sustainable solutions. Yeah, one that's very close to my heart. We've been looking at some stats around how many more jobs social enterprises and small enterprises provide as opposed to mainstream large enterprises, and it's around 3 times the number of jobs, so that's great. Wholesale review of school food funding, tackling causes not symptoms, and working on long-term solutions. So I think, yeah, that's really important that we don't lose sight of, planning for the long term just because we've got this emergency response that we have to make as well. Great. Oh, I think it comes back up. Oh, that's helpful. I don't have to read them all really quickly. So I think we've probably gone through a lot of those. Did you want to go back to the other groups, Morven?
Yeah, I'll just move us on now. So just so that's hopefully nice and clear. The next group is for those who are in the cash first, children's food and partnerships group. So I've just posted that in the chat as well, and I'll just it will be a new code, so I'll just start sharing my screen for that as well. Bear with me. So the new code of 8001161.
Yeah, great.
I'll hand back over to you, Sarah.
So I'll give you some time to put that code in and get the question up, and then again you can start thinking about what were your key takeaways from the session. Was there something that others shared that you didn't know about this area, or something that you learned from the speaker? So as Morven said, this was the cash, I can't see the chat. Cash first, children's food. I think children's food slipped into the last one, but there's never enough talk of children's food. And some of the partnership work again. So there was some feedback in the last session on that one already. So don't institutionalise food banks. So yeah, I think there's been some strong calls for that. It feels like an easy response and a needed response to make, but we need to make sure that we're not institutionalising them. Food economy, lack of clear support to markets. So again, I think another group is slipping in here, but that's all good. Stop over-reliance on large supermarkets. Cross-sector partnerships is essential and needs to be resourced effectively. So a question here, does integrating wraparound support in food aid settings actually institutionalise food aid in the long term? Which other settings would be more appropriate? That's a really interesting question. So by doing what we think is a sort of wraparound support in those food banks, are we actually making them institutionalised? And food can now be a point of entry into preventative services, hubs with mental health and primary care wraparound. Yeah, and I think that what someone said in our group that food has really gained profile, and I think we can see that. So how can it be a point of entry? How do we build on the profile that it's got? Continue to share best practice with other councils when it comes to building networks with local VCSE organisations. So definitely, there's some really good examples in the report of long-term relationships with the VCS sector that really played out during the crisis, and they were, Greenwich and Tower Hamlets and all those places where we saw that. Great. I think we probably want to go on to the next feedback, which is the next question. So what do you think needs to happen next in this area? And I know we're nearly at time, Morven, but are we going to have time for the last groups as well, or do you want them?
Sorry, I'm muting, but I think that should be okay if we whiz through those. So I can just move us on to that one quite quickly now. The slides will also be shared, so if there's anything that people have put into this, I'll just move us on so that those groups have a chance to feedback as well. So
Great.
1 second.
So anyone who hasn't had a chance basically to say anything, or anyone that's got a burning thing that they want to type before we wrap up, then please do so in this last session. So again, what were your key takeaways from the discussion? So I think there's some of the climate, I know some of the economy stuff has come up already, but if there's anything else from those groups, and maybe the food growing group, I don't think we've heard anything from that group yet. So what were your key takeaways from the session? And the code is 5743899. Give you a few seconds to get into it. Choice is crucial, involving all people in decisions making, and needs to have support for people with no recourse to public funds. It's really, really important. So some of those really marginalised communities really need that. Food growing needs to be part of the climate emergency plan. So yeah, as you probably all know, I've got a particular passion for urban growing, and we really saw people leaning into their food growing spaces and the need for more access. Need to address digital divide for communications. I think there's a huge issue there around how we all, those of us that are slightly digital literate were fine, but what about those people that weren't? And particularly even for people like those running food growing spaces, organisations, shops, even they are experiencing problems with digital divide. So it's not just the receivers of food, it's also those people trying to sell and get food to people. Oh, I missed that Meals on Wheels one. Some more stuff here about welfare reforms and how they've disproportionately affected people from certain groups, from people of colour and other minority groups. Culturally appropriate food and choice at a time with contact and interaction. So yeah, really big issue about the nature of the food that was being provided to people. Another comment about urban growing having a positive impact on mental health. Climate is a great lens to take a systems-based approach to improve food in communities, growing, eating better and managing waste. Support for markets and retailers to adapt to go online and adapt to Brexit. We need economic development and retail and community better linked. Building trust between statutory services and people with no recourse for public funds. Local plans need to reflect food growing. So it's this real balance we can see between how do we plan for the long term and how do we respond in an emergency. And again, I think the report sums that up really well, which is, you know, those that have long-term plans are better able to respond in emergencies. So I think that's a real take-home message. People may need support to shop for local ingredients, where on the shelves are the good things. Yeah, so all that thing about how you plan out a shop. There's a very big spectrum in food and climate action. Some councils very good and some miss completely. So yeah, how do we get those that aren't performing so well up the table, so to speak? Do we want to do the last slide, which was what next? So takeaways, what do we needs to happen next? Go for it. Probably got a minute or so, and then I need to 1 minute. Type quickly. Just to say, obviously we will be, as Morgan said, sharing these results and running the webinars, and we'll be sort of working with you all to implement some of these findings and suggestions. So we need to justify the financial case for Meals on Wheels and how it's vital in building a sustainable model, and perhaps more sustained case studies on this and building this view for officers. Sounds good. New food growers, we need support on running an organisation and managing volunteers. More strategic response to support convenience stores. Using council purchasing as an asset for making wholesalers and retailers focus on healthy options. So that was a really good point that Stephanie made in our group about how local authorities can use their buying power to influence convenience stores, and we'll definitely be following that up. Supporting minority-led community and emergency food groups with cash and other resources. So that's really important in reaching those groups. choice sheets for food aid, better communication and trust with migrant groups and local authorities, more funding and control for councils, sounds good, and more structured support for small retailers again. New growing spaces accessible to all, here, more growing is would be a great thing to come out of this, more land access, and build on the changes made to local shopping. Okay, well, thank you for that. Sorry it wasn't as well synthesised as it maybe could have been, but there was quite a lot of varied and fascinating responses there, and I do hope that you all got to share something and take something away, and I'm sure we will be racking through that feedback to see where our role in that is. I think I'm handing back to Stephanie.
Thanks, Sarah. That was really fabulous and interesting. It's a new platform I hadn't seen before, so one to look out for. So I now have the pleasure of handing back to Claire, who is going to just share a few thoughts about this morning. And before we close, off you go, Claire.
Thank you, Stephanie, and Sarah, well done for that. I was so impressive. Television reporter kind of, all that. I was really, I don't know if I could do as good a job as that. I think it's been a really interesting morning. I went into the Access to Older People's group, and actually, and as much as I've been doing this for 20 years, I really welcome the opportunity to talk about that in more detail with people from a number of boroughs and councils. So thank you for that, and I value that, and more of that, and maybe this forum makes more of that possible. But my thoughts from this morning are, and building what the report says, is those partnerships that have existed and the strength of those partnerships give. And I absolutely endorse the Sustainable Food Places approach, because everything that we've discussed this morning is embodied, is encompassed within the Sustainable Food Places approach, and it considers everything, and it provides a framework and a support mechanism and an award system. So I would advocate and strongly support that if you're not already looking at the Sustainable Food Places approach for your borough, then please take that up. I also think the other thing is that, and it came up in the comments, is that balance between a local authority statutory response to an obligation or commitment and the dependence on the third sector. And I think it's a balance that we need to really think about really carefully, and maybe we need to consider more, because full dependence on the third sector to respond to provide food aid or emergency doesn't seem right. Equally, the third sector provides a voice and kind of representation for some of the most vulnerable and diverse groups. So there needs to be a balance, I think, and I think that's a real question of how we achieve that balance, and maybe it's different for each borough, but I think we need to be careful. But however, I think that the third sector and those groups should have a strategic voice in every local area, because they have intelligence that could be really, really useful. So I would advocate that. I can't remember my third point. Oh, I know. Just about the food economy, the diversity of the food economy, how important it is as part of all of this. And we've talked about convenience shops, but they are local employers. They employ nearly 1 in 9 people in London, typically. So they're such a big part of this. So that the partnership approach allows for that kind of integrated system to think about the role of the food economy. And my last would be also social enterprise, because we want to sustain those community groups going forward, and there's a balance between that and that kind of sustainability, then I would say that's probably with social enterprises. So Sarah and I absolutely share that, and of course it's what I do in my day job, so I'm going to say that. But a fantastic morning, thank you all so much. My last word is probably well done to Sustain and everyone for convening this morning, and Stephanie and Simon and Morven for doing this and sharing this with us. And the other one is, if you're not part of the borough subgroup, Liam can maybe put his email on there, but please join the borough subgroup, because the sharing of intelligence, best practice, trying to overcome problems together is done incredibly well in that group. So please support it and get involved. And thank you all so much for an amazing morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire, for that roundup. I am tempted to have some sort of virtual clap for Morven and Simon and the team at Sustain. In fact, let's take off our mute buttons and we can clap loudly.
Oh.
And of course, we need to thank all of the representation from the local authorities, because you have done an extraordinary job managing to get anything back to sustain during this very challenging time. So thank you for being part of it. It's really important that you share your stories so that we can make the very best and hang on to it. So just to close, I just wanted to remind everybody that the report is now on the Sustain website. You can download it. The link is in the chat, but just Google Sustain and you will find the report. You've mentioned, Morven and Sarah have both mentioned the webinar series. That's going to be a really good opportunity to have a really good deep dive into all of these issues and all of the groups that we've seen today to pull out some of the learning and see what we can be doing better in London. So that's a great opportunity. And a reminder, if you've enjoyed this morning, please tweet. You can add those hashtags, but also tag London Food Link and at UK Sustain. I think it's gone really well. I'm absolutely thrilled that we're even managing to finish on time with so much content. So well done everybody for sharing your thoughts, and good luck. And may I just say, keep doing what you're doing. There's now the winter fund to get out so that we can continue to support vulnerable families in our communities. So I know it's a mammoth task to get this done and get it out in time for the Christmas break. But always looking forward to hearing what you're doing and celebrating your successes. So thank you again. I'll say goodbye.
Morven, I hope you're already having a lay down.
Oh, Morven, that was amazing. You've got a pint of gin.
And you have your hair.
Yeah, Simon, what a legend. That was
Yeah.
a moment. So, mate, you did amazingly well.
It's all out of the groups. Classic.
It's always the tech stuff, isn't it? It's always
You just
the tech.
want to run away. Didn't you just want to run away at that